All
This
right.
meeting is being recorded.
Yes, wonderful. Hello, fellow Earthlings. Welcome to Climate Conversation on Indigenous Futurism featuring Dr. Grace Dillon. Climate Conversations is a space for exploring big ideas and challenges that define climate literacy in the 21st century. These are chats with some of the leading voices at the intersection of literature, climate activism, pedagogy, and transformative lived action. The goal is to share insights, to invite you to consider how to apply them in your life as you stand up for your mother planet. Climate Conversations are a feature of Climate Lit, an online resource hub for building universal climate literacy with children's literature and media. And Climate Lit, in turn, is a flagship project of the Center for Climate Literacy at the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development. Our goal in aspiration is to transform education so that it helps us empower young people and accelerate a transition to an ecological civilization. My name is Marek Ozievich, and I will have the pleasure to host today's discussion. Behind the screen and monitoring the chat is Dr. Nick Cleese, who's a Director of Community Engagement at the Center and also one of the editors at Climate Lit. And our guest today is Dr. Grace Dillon. Grace, how are you?
Okay, thank you, Miigwech.
Chimigwech. Grace is Anin. Grace is an Anishinaabe author of speculative fiction, literary critic, and professor in the Indigenous Nation Studies program in the School of Gender, Race, and Nations at Portland State University. Grace teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on a range of topics from Native American and Indigenous studies to science fiction, Indigenous cinema, popular culture, race, and social justice. And some of the works that many of you will be familiar with include Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction, and Hive of Dreams, contemporary science fiction from the Pacific Northwest. Grace is also working on a couple of other projects today that she will probably mention today. But I just wanted to say that Grace is perhaps most notorious in certain rebel circles for coining the term Indigenous Futurism, which is a movement consisting of art, literature, and other forms of media that express Indigenous perspectives of the past, present, and future in the context of science fiction and other artistic speculative fiction genres and creativity. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you so much.
So we will start with Grace sharing a little bit of about her work. And then at the end of the session, we will move into questions, discussion, and more open space for interaction. Grace, the floor is yours.
Okay, all right. Anin, or Ani, since there are so many of us here. One meaning of that, instead of simply hello, is I see the light in you. And it's in my growing up with my own language and Hebrew and Finnish and Russian and a few other languages besides English, it made sense to go ahead and actually um, uh, take a look at Indigenous Futurisms. And I say it with an S now because of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with an S on the end, being fought over for over 30 years before that was made viable, because the S implied genuine tribal sovereignty, no matter where you were mapped or no matter where your land was stretched into other spaces. And what's been becoming really exciting in Indigenous Futurisms, which I did as an homage to Alondra Nelson's special edition, first special edited edition on Afrofuturisms by Black Americans and other African diasporic scholars. And that was in the Social Text Journal in 2002. And in reading and engaging with that kind of thinking, I was realizing that while we have sometimes very different histories, we also have very entangled histories. And so, one of the emphases that I'm finding more and more in Indigenous Futurism's writers as a whole, or filmmakers, or music, etc., is a real interest in expressing Indigenous sciences uh, uh, combined with many other forms of sciences that help in our global weirding that we are now experiencing. Um, as I told Nick and Merrick already in an email, we just ourselves went through a preemptive power outage by Portland General Electric, who handles the whole our whole area in the state of Oregon. And they preemptively shut off power because of all the wildfires that were surrounding many of us, including our family. And just the 96 degrees, which would be very unusual weather in September and in the Pacific Northwest here. Um, there were so many fires and so much smoke that it blanketed in, and it wasn't exactly 96 degrees. And so I love the term global weirding because a lot of the forms of climactic changes and mutations and transformations that are going on, and new terms that we're actually even having to create for intersecting weather patterns, is something that can be wonderfully told in Indigenous Futurism stories. Indigenous Futurisms, like Afrofuturism, African Futurisms, Latinx Futurisms, Asian Futurisms, Arabic or Gulf Futurisms, Israeli Futurisms that can go on. And we have a Routledge handbook that is going into its final printing stages at this point and should be out by the beginning of next year, we hope. Uh, and it's the Routledge Handbook of Co-Futures because this is a global phenomenon. And that's where Indigenous communities ourselves, we can really humbly, with humility and humbleness, add to the importance of not only the discussions, but the implementations of what we could do. And one strong feature um, throughout these, as I worked with Bodhi Chattopadhyay, um, Isaiah Lavender, the third, Taryn Taylor, um, each one coming from their own standpoint. Bodhi is from India and at the University of Oslo, Norway. Isaiah as a Black American with also some Indigenous heritage that can be traced back. And Taryn, who is Panamanian American for the Latinx Futurisms. But what we noticed is with BIPOC futurisms and co-futures, that's Bodhi's term, that body, mind, spirit is given a full context, as opposed to a long, long time ago in the 1980s, the old cyberpunk arguments about body versus mind. being experimented with at various universities and certainly experimented with in Silicon Valley as well. Um, but what we're experiencing now in terms of climate, uh, there was a recent fire, the Calderon fire, that had swept into a tourist hub of Lake Tahoe and created the havoc of trying to escape the flames. In one instance, school children were hastily evacuated across the street as their school went up in flames. In the midst of ICUs and hospital beds and medical staff overrun with largely unvaccinated Delta variant cases of COVID at that point, wildfire smoke had also damaged many human and non-human kin. And this is a quote from the doctor: "Young kids are getting more and more admissions to the emergency room and the hospital with asthma exacerbations due to poor air quality," unquote, says Dr. Miki Sakdeva, a pulmonologist at Kaiser Permanente in Fresno, California. We're seeing more heat exhaustion and heat-related illnesses. With climate change happening, the number of these cases will keep rising. The International Code Red report that was released in a further past August revealed that temperatures have already risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit, with pockets of 3 degrees already. Reaching 3.6 degrees makes extreme heat events almost 14 times more likely. And in our recent COP26, the promises made by wealthier countries who have advanced themselves by conquest, displacement, and enslavement as the fundamental basis of early to later forms of capitalism have fallen far short of both dates and timing and the amounts of actual cash infusion, as we all know and are very aware of. So the YA literature, Indigenous YA literature, I'm just going to bring in and concentrate on a few examples with more detail, but slip in some others as part of the pattern. And one thing that is very much recognized in Indigenous Futurisms, and that is, by the way, goes right along with what has been often named as Indigenous standpoint theory. And so one of the authors that I'll be referring to today, Ambeline Molina, I helped her with her doctoral dissertation, and this is happening in many universities in Canada for First Nations peoples there, including for my family members, and then Australian First Nations as well. And what we are recognizing more and more and talking about more and more is not just simply decolonizing the Anthropocene by saying that there is no Anthropocene or we're anti-Anthropocene. I mean, one can say that, but in a thoughtfully scholastivist engagement, it's important to think of this period as a time of intensifying colonialisms globally all over the world, interacting with each other. And so, like the days of talking about hypercapitalism and cultural studies theory or even popular culture theory, now led by amazing writers like Kyle Powys-White, who is Potawatomi, and he, like Robin Wall Kimmer, who's also Potawatomi, their language has a lot of connections to our Anishinaabe language, and we are sisters and brothers together. As allies in our confederacy. And so intensifying climate, um, along with the consciousness of writing stories for body, mind, spirit, and not drawing away from that or being nervous about doing that, and still being able to call it forms of either science fiction or exceeding science fiction. I really love John Reeder's take on that as he talks about colonialism in the 19th century and science fiction. And rather than getting kind of dragged down into the what kind of category is this? Is this climate literature and YA literature, or is this science fiction, or is this a mixture of speculative with um, science fiction, the fantastic, and the horror? And instead, what he suggests is instead of searching for a genre or subgenres or subcategories, is rather to view it as a family of resemblances. And so the patterns themselves are really decided by our Indigenous creatives. And then the conversations, and now a lot of them, and so I return to Indigenous standpoint theory, are getting masters and doctorates where they write their own novels or books or music videos or poetry or 3D immersion systems, all with Indigenous futures in mind. Graphic novels are a big thing now, video games are really huge, um, TV um, series, all of those to have the courage, in a way, to talk about sciences and scientific fields in connection with um, Indigenous sciences, which I will get to in just a minute. So, as we well know, the conditions of our Anthropocene are experienced unevenly and profoundly shaped by ongoing forms of colonialism, extractivism, and racial capitalism. And in fact, there's a London research conference that just took place, and it was on extractivism, and Indigenous Futurisms was a part of that conference. Anti racism, anti colonialism, and anti capitalism are explored in depth by historian Ibram X. Kendi and philosopher Alexis Shotwell in Perspectives and Controversies in Anti-Racist and Anti-Colonial Anthropocene for Compromised Times. And this is from the Anthropocene Review in 2021. And then another book that I highly recommend, and I actually um, last year taught a course, a Native American Studies or Indigenous Nation Studies course in our department, and it's a 400, 500 level course, so seniors and graduates. And it was on Indigenous perspectives of climate justice and environmental justice. And with Indigenous standpoint theory, you start from your positionality, you start with yourself. Just as Tyson does in his Sand Talk book. He's bringing in his own experiences along with elders' teachings and wisdoms that he has been gifted with along the way. And so I highly recommend, it's a very short book, but very, very powerful. And it was actually done by a number of young Indigenous activists, quite a few. And in fact, in my own class, there were a number of them that knew some of the writers because they're working on this all together and going to the United Nations and traveling globally, and a very strong part of this movement. And so it is. They call themselves simply Red Nation because there's so many names connected. And the title is The Red Deal: Indigenous Actions to Save Our Earth, that came out in 2021. And both of these, the article and the book, suggest the intensity and scale of climate crises require equally powerful and sustained responses by activists, collectivists, and communities working side by side with scientists, artists, and creatives, for there is no neutrality or safe space, as there is also not for racism. It is either racism intertwined with climate and environmental injustices, or a struggling day-to-day anti-racism with stronger moves towards centering climate and environmental justices. And it's one that many of us as Indigenous peoples view as a responsibility that no one, but perhaps especially us as leaders of sustainability, must center also. We already have territories that are 22% of the world, with 80% of our global diversity of human nations, animal nations, plant nations, water nations, and so on, in that 22% of the world. Fortunately, not only climate and environmental justice Indigenous activists and collectivists are working hard on this now, but Indigenous Futurisms as a movement of Indigenous sciences intertwined with song, ceremony, dance, drumming, visualizations, and story, always stories, the high context of science, the kind of Indigenous science that Gregory Kahete speaks of, has also become inundated with novel stories, films, TV series, graphic novels, video games, musical compilations, poetry collections, experiments in 3D immersive digital experiences, art exhibits, social media areas, and so much more are grappling with both climate and environmental justice simultaneously. That's one thing we discovered at our campus is when we were really working on an environmental justice minor and then later major. Our Indigenous Nations Department, we really voiced at the time that you couldn't have environmental justice at this point without also having climate justice, that it has become so entangled and so intertwined that they have to be tackled together. Gaki na wiwe, we are all related. And now I'm going to skip a little bit to some of the actual YA adult Indigenous Futurism stories and give you a couple of examples of that. And also the increasing awareness of Indigenous peoples, whether they're Afro-Indigenous or not, to embrace Afro-Indigenous thinking and think through different histories of racism and colonialism, since climate change only leads to intensified colonialism. The other thing that Kyle Powys White has suggested that I think is a really good point is that there's sometimes this idea that Indigenous sciences are completely static. You know, you learn one form and then, that's what's passed down through storytelling. But the way I grew up is that when we were in the bush, and the stories that my dad would teach me, or when we were going around, those stories were very much a part of the way that we learned sciences and scientific thinking, and we did not think of it as a diminishment in any way, because we realized how much you have to adapt and transform. And in fact, in our word in Anishinaabe for tradition, really speaks to a movement and a flow that's very highly dynamic and ever moving. And that's the conditions of the way that we would live to handle our winters and our summers and the extremes of the different seasons. Um, so what I wanted to bring up is that Indigenous acts of climate justice, like Indigenous forms of environmental justice, are suggesting today, uh, in the 2020s or so, a highly close alliance with Indigenous standpoint theory. That was first initiated in discussions by Martin Nakata in Australia with First Nations peoples, and then highlighted by Eileen Moreton Robinson, also Australian First Nations, in her excellent Critical Tribal Race Theory monograph. And I love now really emphasizing that we do have critical tribal race theories, um, that um, are also something to consider when we think about critical race theories and the legal aspects behind that. And then this was expanded upon by Australian First Nations of the Palyoko people of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, now both lawyer and professor, Ambeline Kwai Molina. And she creates YA literature. And I had the good fortune to be contacted by her as she was working on her doctoral dissertation. And this is happening in Canada and a lot of other places, but it's where you are able to uh, be a creative and do your novel or short series of short stories or whatever it is. And then you are able to critique it from your Indigenous standpoint. And that's what she did for her doctoral dissertation, is she took the final novel that she was working on, The Foretelling of Georgie Spider, and actually made that a part of her doctoral dissertation. And her tribe series are absolutely blow away amazing. They're YA novels. The first one is called The Interrogation of a Shawla Wolf. The second, The Disappearance of Ember Crow. And then The Foretelling of Georgie Spider. And in having a chance to meet her, I was later invited out to Macquarie University and I was able to have wonderful conversations with her. And I knew, because she had even sent me very graciously uh, younger books. So she didn't just do YA, young adult books. She also, for her little ones as they were growing up, she has an illustrated book called Crow and the Waterhole. And that very much brings in climate, always. And then another book that she wrote with her husband is The Things She's Seeing. And that's a ghost story, which for us is all a part of speculative fiction, Indigenous speculative fiction, or futurisms. And then her tribal series. And I'm just going to mention a few things. There's so much to talk about. And honestly, you guys, this is so much better than the Hunger Games series. When I first read it, I was just blown away by it. And she was writing this before Hunger Games series came out. Um, but the character Ashala, the wolf, one thing that starts standing out as a pattern uh, is that for Indigenous peoples to become animal, uh, or to be uh, animal kin is actually less painful of a life than suffering it as a human being. And the reason why I bring this up is that my daughter, they just put out a new collection, Elizabeth LaPense, and others put out a new collection called Howl, an anthology of, and it's basically Indigenous werewolves and Rougarou stories. And everyone in it is Indigenous, the illustrators, the writers, the colorists, everyone in it involved. It's Native operated, Native owned. And none of them, they checked it with each other later on, none of them had planned this in advance. But in all of their stories, they really honor the animal side of the Rougarou or the werewolf or wolf communities. And so I had been already noticing this as a pattern in YA adult literature when written from an Indigenous standpoint theory, whether it's Australian First Nations, like Ambeline Quaimalinas is, whether it's the much more famous at this point Sherry Dimoline's series, The Marrow Thieves, and then Hunting by Stars, that also works with climate. But in Ambeline's series, Tribal Series, um, everything is alive and has personhood. And so Ashala, who has the ability to become wolf and learns to embrace that, and of course, Ambeline herself talks about this as, an allegory and a parable for race and stolen generation and climate change, all kind of mixed together. So Ashala, who is the main protagonist throughout, observes the geography of a first wood, capital F, that appears to reflect her own forest. And then she thinks, or maybe this is the real first wood, and ours is the reflection, which was a freaky thought. It made me happy, and this is Ashala thinking this though, to see the familiar pathways traveled by the tribe, and I marked each branch of the trail in my mind as we passed it. If I turned there, I'd eventually reach the clearing that was our summer camp. There, I'd find my way to where the waratahs grew, the big red flowers from which we harvested a thick, sweet honey. There I'd go to the cave system that was our shelter in the winter. The caves were also where Ember had her laboratory, in quotes, mixing up her various herbal concoctions and inventing stuff. So here, just within a few lines, you have Indigenous sciences. You have the observation and the awareness of your plant kin and plant nations and animal nations around you. What parts of the plant that you can harvest, and even what kinds of shelters that easily accommodate different kind of forms of global weirding. And this particular series starts with The Reckoning, it's simply called, but it's essentially the time of great chaos of global weirding, climate change, and the continuous imbalances of systems 300 years ago. So her series is set 300 years after our times of global weirding. In this world of balance and the greater balance, this first wood, sort of, feels immediately brighter than it should be. Quote, the colors so vivid it almost hurt to look at them. Plus, I was glowing with a faint blue light, unquote. When citizens died, their spirits were supposed to go to the greater balance, the world soul. Ashala thinks that the illegals, with a capital I, including her, and of course that's a reference to Australian First Nations young ones that were part of the stolen generation. Um, and they did too, even though the government said our fate was uncertain, being as we were outside the natural order. And so what she's doing is she's grappling with a system that views her as an illegal and outside of a natural order, let alone forest kin, plant nations, or animal nations. And so she heads into what feels like a dreaming or a feeling, like being in a reflected and mirrored world, leading her to a deep, deep blue lake, one she recognizes as her lake, as a massive snake, pale blue scales shimmering with rainbows in the light, and Grandfather Serpent. And Grandfather Serpent speaks to her conversationally as, quote, I am your many times grandfather, one of the creators of your people. And he becomes her mishkiki, her medicine of healing, as he brings up and voices out loud her pain that she does not even realize she carries. The conversation between them decolonizes, cleanses, and heals her mind, and also gives her hope of endurance and persistence, in spite of being hunted for and incarcerated as a dangerous illegal surrounded by enforcers. Grandfather Serpent assures her that his kind has taken many forms and continues to do so. Quote, when the great chaos began, that's back to the reckoning and our climate change, I was sleeping deep in underground water. My resting place broke apart, and I was cast out into the end of everything, unquote. But notably, the end of everything serves as a catalyst for Grandfather. I journeyed for a long time, gathering all the scraps of life that I could find. I brought them here. Then I sang, reminding life of its shapes, strength, and its many transformations, until life remembered its nature and grew, unquote. As one of the old spirits of earth, he offers her aid any time that she may need it. Quote, he says to her, you might be the last to carry the bloodline of those I created in the world that was, unquote. The SARS, which in some ways could be viewed a little bit like dinosaurs, but they are SARS as a special animal kin, who also speak, and they speak out loud, and they speak the children's language. To Ashala's surprise, share some wisdoms of their own songs. Quote, our songs say humans fear difference, and when they are afraid, they will find a way to destroy their fear, unless they do not know it is there, unquote. Memories of animal peoples like the SARS and even the memories of Firstwood itself come alive through conversation with each other. The first place that trees grew after the reckoning, Firstwood, also grew from seeds that survived the great chaos. Quote, they carry within themselves, wanders too far, as Sar elaborates, quote, the memories of their ancestors, the lost forests of the old world. They do not forget what humans have done. And so, what I've noticed in a lot of Indigenous YA, and I can send a list, but just referencing like Aaron Paquette's Light Finder, Anishinaabe Carter Meelan's Stories for a Lost Child. Uh, there's just so many to name here, and also as graphic novels, where the language, if you go out into outer space, the language is entirely in that tribal nation's language throughout, and it's identified as vocabulary words that you can then look up in a glossary at the back. And so our languages and preserving them helps us um, rethink, reshape, and be ever dynamic about what our kinship relations should be. Um, and so interspecies communication, animal nations, and animal persons are energetically capable of creating kinship relations with human peoples. That is a trend in Indigenous Futurisms. Billy Ray Belcourt, uh, who is also Two Spirit and LGBTQAI, in an article, Animal Bodies, Colonial Subjects, Relocating Animality in Decolonial Thought, in Society's number 1, 2015, 1 through 11, spends some time on, since he's Cree himself, on Cree communities and animal persons, such as ravens, as either creators themselves with a capital C, or often become the person who the creator acts through. And so understanding is comprehended by animal peoples and shared with human persons that are attentive enough to those expressed interspecies communications, something that Merrick, I think, had been talking about. Many of us may be familiar with Ava Majer's When Animals Speak Towards an Interspecies Democracy in 2019. The chickadee language, that's my favorite bird, much like our Anishinaabe language, where playing with extending herbs can become very quickly inventive and fun. The chickadee language consists of a variety of different sounds that can be combined creatively. The syntax of the black-chinned hummingbird also has an open system similar to that of starlings and humans. The songs of humpback whales are formed like sentences consisting of smaller units that are combined to form songs containing up to 400 elements. Mexican free-tailed bats discuss everything from territory to social status, love, raising children, and other social affairs. Their sounds are even beyond the range of human vocalization, can now be caught with advanced technologies. Researchers from the Elephant Listening Program, for instance, used recordings to capture not only their communication of information, but also their emotions and intentions. This is not merely animal nations' vocalizations in language, but also other bodily gestures. Lizards have 4 ways to express themselves by their posture, the number of legs they have on the ground, nodding their head, and displaying or inflating their chin. Quote, this may seem fairly simple, but there are 6,864 possible combinations, of which 172 are frequently used, unquote. And Claire G. Coleman's Terra Nullius, which is not necessarily a YA novel, but it is speaking about children, and it's definitely a book that I share for Indigenous YA and other young adults. And in that, there is, and it's her story is based on the actual experimentations by Australian First Nations elders and bush leaders that were also scientists and working with other non-Indigenous scientists. And they discovered that the really huge cane toad that came in, the giant cane toad, as an invasive species, had wiped out many of the shire lizards that could handle droughts a lot better and the kinds of changes that are taking place on Australia as a continent currently. So there's a real interest in maintaining these smaller lizards, and it was the Bangalara elders who were able to teach the shy lizards. They were able to bring them out and basically give them what was a form of an inoculation or vaccination of the poison from the cane toads, because the cane toads were just, poisoning everything around them. And so she has a beautiful, it's all about climate justice book with giant cane toads that literally become alien persons from another planet. Um, and then the descriptions of these kinds of combinations, along with language translations and language learned. Leanne Besamasoke Simpson imagines radical futures with her novel poetry Nupaming, The Cure for White Ladies, uh, University of Minnesota Press, 2020. So many of you here may recognize that. And references In the Bush, Nupaming, and another poetic play on Biska Biang, used frequently for decolonization and radical resurgence by returning to ourselves as the home that we will always want to return to. But when I was young, this expression was more often used to mean returning to the woods or in the bush, as if that was just automatically your home and you didn't have to say that. Nature for us, we were trying to figure out a term that's closest to nature in our language, and some of us came up with Anibi, which means outside. So nature becomes outside anytime you're outside. Queering grounded normativity is so well thought through in her As We've Always Done, and in this sense becomes a radical future of literalizing metaphor, a common device used often in science fiction, but more so reflects Enendumoan, thought turning into will, into being. And that's a Anishinaabe expression. Mashkawaji, they them lie frozen in ice. Remember the sharpness of unmuted feelings from long ago, and find freedom and solace in that isolated, suspension made community, with the Akawenzi, an old man representing the narrator's will, Ninatig, a maple tree that reflects and mirrors the lungs, Minda Muyenna, an old woman and their conscience, Save, a gentle giant and their marrow, Attic, caribou and their nervous system, Asen and Lucy, human persons that are their eyes, ears, and brains. How does one commune beyond an unnatural urban settler world, in Endumoan and imagining radical futures? How does one break open the self to a world or worlds alive with human persons, animal persons, ancestor persons, and spirit persons through story, song, dance, mishkiki, indigenous sciences, medicine, and healing? In Cherokee Nation, Daniel H. Wilson's novel Robogenesis and the awakened freeborn, who are all machine-like, and the thinking polyps growing on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, inaccessible even to a super cute computer that is busy melding with the Cherokee Nation man. Quote, my face is a slab of meat over bone, my voice dead as the space between galaxies, unquote, while petting a tiny insectile head, a parasitic metal scorpion. Quote, I guess it just feels like the natural thing to do, unquote. And just when it appears that this AI can dislodge feelings and memories, mixed images appear in his mind spirit, and a thudding sonic vibration becomes a deep sound, the quote, bellowing of some prehistoric titan big as a mountain range. And then comes the memory slippage back into Cherokee long ago stories, like those that appear at great length in Cherokee Nation Daniel Heath Justice's epic fantasy, The Way of Thorn and Thunder, speaking in the old language of racks and trees. and I'm hoping I can slip in. Oh, okay. Uh, I left out the best one, which is Lipan Apache Nation, Darcy Little Badgers, A Snake Falls to Earth in 2021. But
It's a brilliant book. I just finished it like 2 weeks ago. I loved it.
okay,
Loved it.
and and I made the mistake of saving that for the end. I should have just done that at the beginning.
Grace, this was absolutely, it was so rich what you shared with us. And we're hoping that maybe we can create a list of the titles and then post it under the
Absolutely.
recording, right?
Yes, absolutely. I'll send that to you, and I'll be sure to send that as well. Yeah, because that has the reflecting world,
Reflecting
and
world,
Darcy Little
exactly.
is an earth scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got our earth, and then you've got the reflecting world. But it's also a true story uh, from Lip and Apache memories.
Yes, yes. I just discussed it with my students on Tuesday, I think, on Tuesday in our book
Oh,
discussion. So I had a group of undergrads who read this book, and we had wonderful discussions. So yeah, brilliant, brilliant book, very powerful.
and did your as a group, did you guys notice how the it is it's better to be animal kin than it is to be mutated into your human shape from an animal? And that's a very indigenous kind of perspective and way of looking at it, right?
Mhm.
Because, it's with Western thought that we have vampires and we have werewolves and we have, you become unnatural when you become an animal.
No, and in the book,
So
it's the true
that is,
form. Yes,
yes,
the true form is the animal form, and the false form is
yes,
the human one.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And
Grace,
that's
we have about 7 minutes, last minutes, and I wonder, I don't know, Nick, do we have any questions from the audience at this point? Because you said so many things, and I was taking notes on Ambelina's integration, the tribe series, which I love. It's a
oh,
wonderful, absolutely brilliant series. And
yeah.
there's just my goodness. So I wonder if we have any questions from the audience. Nick, please send them over. Otherwise, my question, Grace, would be,
Uh-huh.
okay, so pretty much everyone agrees that we need to integrate these indigenous knowledge ways of seeing the world, relating to the world. That's why we need this indigenous standpoint theory. That's why we need, all of these components of indigenous relating to the world. And I wonder, what do you think is the path that white people could take, in relation to these indigenous ways of knowing? Like, is there a way that white people can become a little bit indigenized, or like, how do we do this?
Yes, that is such a wonderful, intense, and complicated question, and it's something that Linda Twahi Smith, in her very famous Decolonizing Handbook, goes into a great detail with, and when she reissued it in 2012, has a brilliant final chapter that really spends even more time with that. And
Okay.
I suspect, Eric, that you know this already, but that you are an ally. So the fact that
Mm-hmm.
you are teaching Darcy Little Badgers and a Lipan Apache perspective um, with your students, to me, that immediately becomes a quiet kind of allyship and shows the true spirit of allyship, which is the generosity to listen, um, to those stories and those standpoints in BIPOC futurisms or in co-futures. And so we're all learning from each other. And I think it's those cross conversations and cross dialogues. I mean, oh, I didn't even mention Whelp, but it's this beautiful book. I'll send the information on it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's written by a young um, Afro Canadian. Well, no, she was in Alaska, so African American. Uh, and she wrote this at 22, but she had grown up in Alaska around specific tribal nations and had gotten into climate activism because of them. And so throughout her book, Wealth, it's this amazing, like, personal memoir and interactions and exchanges where she's always bringing in Indigenous voices. And that again is a recognizable, like, when I do a review of an article on Indigenous futurisms, and if there are no Indigenous voices being cited, whether for theory or, climatology, which is what Kyle Whitehouse is. He's a climatologist. Um, if it doesn't have that, then it's very lacking.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Grace, on behalf of our audience and the audience who will watch this later online, the recording, I want to thank you so much for your time and wonderful sharing. We're so much richer thanks to you. We will also add these books and the links to the books that you mentioned and talked about later to the recording. And our time
Sure.
is unfortunately up. So thank you so much
Okay.
again on behalf of the center, on behalf of all of us here. It's been such an inspiring conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, and I really look forward to anyone that wants to get in touch with me. You're welcome to put down my university email address, and I'm happy to have conversations.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, everyone.